That review is the perfect introduction for our next segment. It's now truly an honor to introduce two legislative giants for whom this historic legislation is named, Chris Dodd and Barney Frank. Many things have been said about them, and they've heard most of them, but I'm going to try and say a few things they haven't heard yet in an introduction. Chris Dodd served as a senator for 30 years. After serving in the House for 6 years, he was a key participant for decades in nearly every major national policy debate, and he authored major legislation in the areas of education, healthcare, foreign policy, and election reform, in addition to financial services. Barney Frank served 32 years in the House of Representatives after serving 12 years the people of Massachusetts in various city and local capacities. He, too, was at the forefront of virtually all the major issues facing the country over those decades. It is almost impossible to describe the complexity and difficulty in enacting any major legislation in the ordinary course. To do that under the historic and unprecedented circumstances facing the country in 2008, 2009, and 2010 infinitely multiplied the hurdles and made success a long shot at best. The good news was that during those years, as the Wall Street-caused financial and economic catastrophe slammed the country, both of these men were at the height of their legislative power. Chris was chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. Barney was the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. And at that point in their careers, they were well-known and highly regarded statesmen and very sophisticated legislators. Any serious legislative effort, a response to the financial crash and the economic crisis, would only happen if those two leaders could steer it through their respective committees, then through and off the House and Senate floors, and then a conference committee, all the while keeping the leaders of Congress and the administration on board, not to mention the innumerable, very powerful outside groups and constituencies. And of course, they had to do all of that, as President Obama said, in the face of daily, unrelenting opposition from the entrenched and well-funded opposition who tried to block any reform at all. As if that wasn't enough, all that had to be done under intense media scrutiny. The challenge for Senator Dodd in the Senate was multiplied because he was also the leader on the historic health care legislation moving through the Senate at the same time. And filling in for my former boss and Chris and Barney's dear friend, Senator Ted Kennedy, who we lost in August of 2009. So in addition to doing everything under the Banking Committee activities, he was also shouldering and carrying the torch on healthcare legislation. To say the least, the task facing Chris and Barney was truly daunting, if not Sisyphean. The fact that we're hearing from them today, 10 years after passage of the landmark legislation which bears their name, validates what I and many others believe, that they were uniquely positioned and talented to bring to fruition probably the most important piece of banking and financial legislation ever enacted into law. I say that based on personal experience because I was privileged to be on the Senate floor for most of the consideration and passage of the Senate bill and then the Dodd-Frank Act itself. No one will ever know how truly difficult this undertaking was, and no words will ever fully capture the achievement. Now, none of that is to say that the law was perfect. It was not. Particularly one, no law is, particularly one that intends to re-regulate one of the most complex and sprawling sectors of the economy. However, it was the best law the U.S. political system could produce at the time, and remember, it passed without one vote to spare. All things considered, including that the most powerful, wealthy industry in the history of the world opposed it with unmatched ferocity, it has been an effective law responsive to the causes of the crisis, and by the time the Obama administration left office, it was well on its way to being properly implemented. And as I mentioned earlier, and as we've detailed in the reports I talked about, it has also been responsible for preventing the current pandemic-caused economic crisis from becoming a banking crisis. Now, in thinking of a moderator with the subject matter expertise and journalistic acumen to illuminate the backstory behind the making of the legislation and its ongoing importance, my first thought was Stephanie Ruhle. Stephanie is the senior business correspondent for NBC News and the anchor on her widely watched daily show, MSNBC Live. She brings a practitioner's experience and eye to all these issues, having worked for many years in the financial industry and the markets. As a result, She has street cred and knowledge and well understands the nexus between finance and Washington. Her coverage of these areas, including the CARES Act, what's going on with the pandemic and everything going on now, is as informed and insightful as you will find anywhere. With that, I turn it over to Chris, Barney, and Stephanie.
Ended up in television because I sold credit derivatives for a living to hedge funds at Deutsche Bank, and the financial crisis and Dodd-Frank put me out of business. So that's sort of how I ended up here. Thank you so much. This is such an important day, and it's an honor to be with both of you. I would love it if we could start with a little bit of a history lesson. 10 years ago, you were in the room for the most important conversations, for the conversations that began with President Bush's financial regulators sort of briefing Congress that we had, impending economic collapse through our financial system. So can you take us back to sort of when this all began? Chris?
Well, first of all, let me thank Better Markets and Dennis Kelleher, a good friend over here. I'm delighted to be my partner, and here, Barney Frank. We had a great relationship together working on this bill and other matters over the years. Thank you to George Washington University and President Obama. Barney and I were both here. This wouldn't have happened without an administration that was tremendously supportive. Yeah. And the other panelists you'll have on, including Warren later.
They need to be able to see you.
Dealing with the Consumer Protection Bureau. You're absolutely correct. I'm glad you began, Stephanie, with that question, because it's important to remember what Barney and I went through in the fall, the summer and the fall, the Congress did, dealing with the collapse. Pelosi's conference room on September 18, 2008, when we were told by the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Chairman Bernanke, that unless we acted in the Congress in a matter of days, a good part of the financial system of the United States and the world would melt down. Didn't say it in a hyperbolic way. It was very calm, but very factual, very clear. And so we left that meeting wondering whether or not we could pull together a piece of legislation that would manage to get us out of the immediate problem, which we did with the TARP legislation. Maybe the most unpopular thing that Barney and I maybe ever did in our tenure in public service. And I will go to my grave believing one of the most necessary things we did. That led, of course, to the efforts with the financial reform bill. Barney and I would both tell you that the healthcare issue intervened. And if I had to go back and do it over again, I would suggest that we ought to start immediately after the crisis of the summer of 2008. By the time we got around to 2010, so today, the signing ceremony, a lot of the public had moved on. The memories of what had happened in the summer and the fall of 2008 were fading. And so we acted when we did, but it was not easy. And then lastly, I would just mention this, and it's important to remember this. In the summer and the fall of 2008, you had the Congress controlled by Democrats, the White House controlled by the President Bush's administration. We were 40 days away from a national election. Not exactly the time when you'd normally be expecting how to come together, pull together, to try and get our country back on its feet again. And were it not for Barney working what he did in the House, I was blessed to have colleagues of mine in the Senate who understood it. We were able to get over that hump. And then we had to, of course, go forward and try and deal with the very problems that created the mess to begin with, which became the Dodd-Frank bill.
Wow. Congressman Frank, can you hear us?
Yes.
Take us back to when this all first began, how you started crafting Dodd-Frank. When you think about the gargantuan task and the disaster that we were in, it's extraordinary that you were able to make this happen. So can you sort of take us back to the room or the rooms or that time period?
It begins early in 2008. And one of the things that should be stressed here, I think Dennis has made this point, this became partisan, unfortunately, in Congress because the Republicans basically refused to cooperate with us. Chris had some cooperation early on, which he worked for, and then they decided to pull the plug on that. I never had much cooperation in the House side, but this began very collaboratively with the Bush administration. And, people ask, when did vicious partisanship begin in America? January 21st, 2009, when Barack Obama became president, because from 2007, 8, 9, and 10, two Democratic houses, House and Senate, worked very closely with the Bush administration in dealing with this. And we began in 2008, and the first indication I had was when the Bush administration engineered the takeover of Bear Stearns by J.P. Morgan Chase. And at that point, Bernanke and Paulson, the leaders of the financial policy of the Bush administration, explained that they thought we were in trouble and that if a major institution failed, we wouldn't be able to handle that. And of course, that became true when Lehman failed. And they wanted to talk about changing that. And as we explained to them, getting the Congress to move in that situation, interestingly, with almost overwhelming Republican opposition to what the Bush administration was asking, would be very hard. And so we stayed in touch with them. On the House side, we were moving on adopting legislation to deal with the mortgage problem. We actually got a bill passed that ultimately became part of the larger bill. But we didn't have the political heft to do anything major until the crisis hit, unfortunately. At that point in September, we did have very strong cooperation, House, Senate, and the executive. Interestingly, the Senate was bipartisan at that point. Senator Shelby, the leading Republican, was opposed to it, but he wasn't obstructive. The Senate Republicans on the whole were supportive. Several of them, by the way, paid a price for that in the next year when they got defeated in primaries. Kay Bailey Hutchinson in Texas, Bob Bennett in Utah. So we had the House Democrats, the Senate Republicans and Democrats, and the administration. And at that point, we began to work fairly closely together, and including, by the way, while obviously this was immediately dealing with the crisis through the funding for lending the money to the bank, we set the basic outlines to a great extent of the legislation as well. And people should understand when the right wing, when President Trump, when others denounced this legislation as a Democratic overreach, they should understand that all of the major regulators appointed by George W. Bush agree with the basic outlines of the bill.
Then I want to reference the report that Better Markets released today on Dodd-Frank has this whole section about it being a bipartisan bill, although it was enacted in a largely partisan vote. Senator, do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I'm glad that Dennis made that point in the bill. Others have already not read it. We only passed the bill because we had a supermajority, and we were able to. 3 Republicans in the Senate supported the bill. We lost a Democrat. Ted Kennedy had passed away, and so it was right on the margins. So the actual outcome looks partisan, but I can go back through that bill any number of instances and point out the bipartisan nature of what's in the bill. I wrote down some of them here just to make the point. The Office of Financial Research in the Treasury Department. That was a Republican idea to put it in the Department of Treasury. FSOCs, there were those who wanted to create an independent department. We put that in the Treasury Department at the behest of our Republican friends. Making the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau an independent agency, my friend Bob Corker of Tennessee was the author of that idea along the way. And then we did things like, I never told anybody ahead of time, but I invited Democrats and Republicans to share responsibility for various aspects of a very complicated proposal. And so I had Mark Warner and Bob Corker deal with too big to fail, Chuck Schumer and Mike Crapo dealt with I think corporate governance. I had Jack Reed and Judge Reg deal with the derivatives market. Shelby and I worked on the Consumer Protection Bureau. So we had that cooperation didn't solve every problem, but it produced some very positive results in the process going forward. And then on the floor of the Senate, we debated 60 amendments. Half of them were Republican amendments. About 10 of them were accepted unanimously. Another 5 or 8 of them were debated amendments, and Republicans carried the day. And I never demanded a 60-vote margin except on one of the 60 amendments. So if you had 50 votes, you could win or lose, rather than creating super majorities on every single vote you had, which has become routine today. So we made a real effort. Hank Paulson, when we finished the bill, used language very positive, describing what was in the bill. In fact, a lot of the bill, one of the kept secrets, if you will, is that I followed, Barney and I followed to some extent, the recommendations of the G20, which was a proposal signed by world leaders, including President Bush. Now, we didn't go letter for letter, but we understood the value, not just of having a financial bill dealing with architecture and structure at home, but to what extent could we get cooperation globally? Not verbatim cooperation, but at least agreeing on principle. And so following the G20 to some extent, a document endorsed and signed by the Bush administration, I think is another example of the kind of, quote, bipartisanship that we sought to have. And I made a Herculean effort in the Senate to get any Republican from the very beginning. And Bob Corker really was the only Republican to begin with who was willing to sit down and work with me. And we did for weeks on end to try and pull the bill together. So I take great offense as someone who spent 30 years in the Senate following the model of senators who preceded me, who cherished the idea of getting cooperation between the two parties to move major issues forward. So it was not for any lack of effort. In fact, in many cases, actually succeeding to have a significant amount of Republican participation in the adoption of this bill.
Congressman Frank, what do you think?
Somewhat different experience because historically the Senate has been a somewhat civilizing influence on House members who are free to be a little bit more rambunctious with smaller districts, although that has substantially diminished over time. And I think the difference in that regard between the House and Senate is gone, partly because, as I said, several of the Republican senators who were taking the lead in being bipartisan during the crisis were defeated in primaries in 2010. Mike Castle from Delaware, who lost to the, I think I am not a witch person in the primary, fortunately. Kay Bailey Hutchinson, they called her Kay Bailout Hutchinson. Poor Bob Bennett, a very impressive, thoughtful guy, couldn't even get on the ballot in Utah because of anger, because he'd been too cooperative. But on the House side, I had trouble beginning in 2008. We were passing a bill, or maybe late 2007, we were passing the bill to restrict the sale of mortgages that shouldn't be sold. Ironically, of course, the right wing said, oh, you liberals, you gave all these mortgages to people who shouldn't have gotten them. When we passed in the House the bill to restrict bad mortgages, the Wall Street Journal attacked me for restricting minorities' ability to buy these houses. Spencer Backus, who was then leading Republican, the senior Republican on our committee, supported the bill and brought with him a significant minority of Republicans. As a result of him supporting this bill to ban abusive, predatory mortgages that were the source of the problem more than anything else because they couldn't be repaid, he almost lost his position. Some of the conservative Republicans, including the lady chairman, Jeff Hensley, complained to the Republican leadership that he was being much too cooperative with us, and he had to fight very hard to get his position back. And he, as part of that, he had monitors. He had Republican leadership people installed to watch him. I once complained to him about a statement he had issued that was really more off the wall than usual, and he explained that it wasn't his statement. It was one that had been written in the Republican leadership office, and he had to sign it. So, and then of course we had the TARP, when the majority of House Republicans voted against that bill both times, heavily the first time, not quite as heavily the last time, but here we are in this terrible crisis, and there's bipartisanship in the Senate under Chris's leadership, but in the House, even on the second vote, even after the stock market has had its biggest one-day loss ever up to that time, a majority of House Republicans still voted against it, and the Republican leadership explanation was that Nancy Pelosi had made a speech that they thought was too partisan, so to punish her, they voted against their president's proposal to save the economy. Therefore, it was no surprise to us when in the House the next year when we were doing the bill, we got virtually no Republican support. I think we had two Republicans. One was a kind of an accidental Republican who was a Republican from New Orleans, the only one I think since Benjamin Butler after the Civil War, and he served a few months because of a Democrat who got sent to prison, and then Mike Castle, who was defeated in the primary in Delaware the following year.
Senator, you had said in the beginning that by the time this happened in 2010, a lot of people had forgotten all the problems that we faced in 2008 and how complicated things were. Just in the last few minutes, when I hear the two of you speak about all of what this legislative process encompassed, was this the most difficult, technically difficult thing you had ever taken on and your teams when you think about all that you had to cover?
Well, it was. And you know, it just seemed to me that we couldn't go through what we'd gone through in 2006, actually, 2007, 2008, and come back out and leave it because we had taken a sizable hunk of taxpayer money and given it to invest in many healthy lending institutions and walk away as if the problems had been solved. In fact, for decades, people have been talking about the reform of the financial services architecture. But typically in our country, in a democracy, it takes a crisis to get people to move. The problem in this case was, and I understand the administration's point, they had a chance, they really wanted to deal with healthcare and decided to move on that directly. Of course, President Obama was just coming into office. So the following half really consumed that very difficult process. We watched the Congress and the country become more polarized. And so for all of those reasons, the delay in coming around to the bill again, the delay in resulting in the kind of heightened partisanship made it more difficult. And given the magnitude of the issue, we didn't solve every problem. We didn't intend to. Here there are a lot of issues. We'll probably talk about some of them that might have wanted to include if we had been able to write exactly what we wanted to in a bill like this. So it was tremendously complex. But I'm glad I did what I mentioned to you earlier, Stephanie, and that is by involving my colleagues on the committee to become part of the problem solving. This couldn't fall entirely to a chairman of the committee. I always felt the best chairman I watched were people who made an effort to include their members in the crafting of ideas, get them invested in the product, if you would. And so that made a big difference because people became engaged. They were asking to contribute their ideas and thoughts to making the bill work. And that really helped tremendously.
But even contributing ideas and thoughts, Congressman Frank, how much of a financial services architecture education did you need?
A lot. Let me say something that I know Chris agrees with, and he's said it himself. None of this would have been remotely possible with one of the great underappreciated assets in America. The wonderful, bright, dedicated, self-sacrificing women and men who serve as our staff. Chris and I were both lucky to have, although obviously it wasn't random, we get some credit, but we had people working for us who were as talented as anybody, who were doing it for much less money, in much worse conditions, physically and in every other way. And so that was the main thing, that these people, I could not have understood all this, and Chris couldn't have, but collectively we had a great deal of help. even with that, it was tricky. You ask about what the experience was like. I went to bed. Now, I wasn't going to get any Republicans. When we passed the bill that year, there were 71 members of the committee, 42 Democrats and 29 Republicans. I literally went to bed on nights when I had trouble sleeping, counting Democrats. I couldn't go to sleep until I got to 36 on any given issue. We had a series of markups on this bill. And literally until I got to 36, I would have trouble sleeping. Fortunately, we did on almost every issue. But yeah, it was complicated by several things. First of all, the substance. Then, remember, we were not an island here. We had to consider the impact of other countries, the competitive position of America might be importing. We had that whole set of things. I noticed just recently that the former Prime Minister of France, François Fillon, was indicted. And I remembered at the time that he was actually in my office because the French embassy in Washington, stupidly, is about a foot from Maryland. So to get from the French embassy to Capitol Hill takes about 2 hours during rush hour. And he wanted to talk to me, and I could not get there. We had votes. So I had the president of France in my office, which my father would have appreciated. And you had that set of things going as well. And we also had, you talk about architecture, one of the big issues also then was the multiplicity of regulators we had. And I got to say, I was struck. One of the things that strikes me is the extent to which Republicans made very partisan criticisms of what we did. And then from 2011 until the beginning of 2019, they did virtually nothing to correct any of what they said were grave errors. And in a forum we had recently that was put on by Brookings with Chris's leadership, a high-ranking White House economic official criticized us because we hadn't done anything to diminish the number of regulators. And I didn't get a chance to ask him, but for the 2 years that Donald Trump had a Republican House and Senate, they didn't do a thing in that regard. But yeah, it was substantively complicated, politically complicated. There were international implications. It really was I would say it was a Rubik's Cube, except I have never been able to solve a Rubik's Cube, and we did get through this one.
Let me add, Stephanie, to you. Let me add on the point that Barney made. First of all, let me second what he said about our staff and remarkable people who were involved in going through this with us. We did something else in the Senate. I suspect Barney did the same. I said to every outside interest, if you want to be heard, we're going to hear you. I won't necessarily be involved in these conversations, but if you have something you want to share with the Senate Banking Committee, I will guarantee you'll get an opportunity to be heard. And I don't know of anyone who didn't take advantage of that. Some may not have, but I wanted to make sure that door was open. But they couldn't at the end of the process say, I couldn't even be heard on an issue. So my staff, in addition to offering great counsel and advice and working with Barney's and other members, also spent a lot of time with stakeholders in the bill that we were proposing and gave each and every one of them an opportunity to be heard on their various ideas. And that, I think, played an important role as well.
Senator, we rarely see anyone in government give anyone else, definitely from previous administrations, credit. But here we are facing an economic crisis today that was sparked by a health crisis. And our globally significant financial institutions are actually in very good shape. Lending practices are working. The pipes that you cleaned up and retooled through Dodd-Frank are working. If Dodd-Frank wasn't enacted, what situation do you think we would be in right now, given what's happening economically?
I think we would have collapsed economically. How we would have come out of this if we didn't have banks with the capital, the liquidity, their ability, their profitability, their strength to be able to play such a constructive role over the last 20 weeks. And I don't know of anyone who disagrees with that, nor do they disagree with the conclusion that had we had the complication of a financial system that could not respond, as well as the pandemic and all of the economic implications of that, we'd be in such a deep hole. I worry if we could get out of it. So I know we didn't, with all of our stress testing and going forward, no one envisioned dealing with a pandemic, a global pandemic. But I happen to believe, and others who are following this now more closely than I am, have said over and over again, that the strength of our financial institutions has made an incredible difference. We've got a long way to go, obviously, and we've got deep economic problems, but they would have been far, far worse had we not done what we did 10 years ago.
There's also a wide array of financial institutions, banks alone. Congressman, when you think there's really only about 10 global, significantly important banks, I mean the behemoth Wall Street banks, then beneath them there are thousands of community and regional banks out there. How complicated was that for you to create this legislation, knowing that so many of these institutions serve different purposes and serve different customers?
I should say at the beginning, I am a member of the board of directors of an important regional bank, and I think people should, you always want to make that clear. Well, for instance, it explains one of the issues that I just referred to. One of the complaints we had was we have too much duplication in regulation. And there were three major examples of it. We resolved one of them. There was both the Office of the Control of the Currency and the Office of Thrift Supervision, which chartered national banks. The Office of Thrift Supervision was for savings and loans. The Control of the Currency was for commercial banks. The Office of Thrift Supervision developed a deserved reputation for being kind of easy on the people that regulated. We ultimately abolished them. We merged them with the OCC. My plan B there was to change their name to the Office of Fig Leaf Dispensation. But we did resolve that conflict. But the other two we couldn't touch for political reasons. One was the split, and it's crazy, that derivatives are regulated by both the Commodities Futures Trading Commission and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Derivatives started out as based on commodities. That's why it's the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. Then the financialization of derivatives took over. The SEC got involved. But if you tried to merge those two, you would have the farm community furious that the financial big shots were taking over. But the other one, where Chris took a courageous lead, was to try to consolidate regulation of banks between the Office of the Control of the Currency that regulates national banks and the Federal Reserve that regulates state-chartered banks. And there was a proposal to merge them. And it was vetoed by the most politically influential group that we were dealing with, precisely who you talked about, the multitude of community banks. They have much more power than Citibank or Bank of America because they've got people in everybody's district who are civically active and friends of the members, and they have employees in everybody's district. And the head of the independent community bankers, many of which are state chartered, came and said, look, there's no way you can put us in the same regulator as the big guys. If there was a common regulator, if it was either the Fed or the OCC, then the smaller banks and JP Morgan Chase would have the same regulator. And they said, no, one side doesn't come close to fitting well. So they vetoed that effectively. Also, when we drafted the bill, we frankly made several changes in favor of the community banks. They are not inspected by the CFPB. They're covered by its rules, but the CFPB doesn't send a team to examine them because they said that would cost too much. We had a fight over deposit insurance. We raised it from $100 to $250 to protect small banks from losing deposits of a large amount to bigger banks who are perceived to be, quote, safer, unquote. I wanted to do it even more. The big banks fought us on that one, but that was another example of where we did some differentiation. Finally, and I think we didn't do it enough, and Chris and I supported, not entirely the whole bill, but a part of the bill that passed last 2018, which exempted banks under 10 billion from the Volcker Rule, and said banks again under 10 billion in assets could make loans that would otherwise be dubious, as long as they were to keep them in their own portfolio. In other words, run the risk themselves. So we did do some differentiation in the original bill, and in two respects, I think, improved upon it.
Senator, what about the non-banks, the financial institutions that were also part of this, the AIGs, the Lehman Brothers, the hedge funds, the private equity firms? How did you factor in their roles, what kind of regulations they needed, and this legislation? And their huge
part of it
lobbying
was
effort.
with the FSOC. Yeah, with the FSOC was an effort. Obviously, the Financial Stability Oversight Council was the idea to look at systemically important, systemically risky institutions. And it wasn't confined, obviously, to ones that qualified by definition or legal definition, so that we could take a look at some of them. And this has been a source of significant contention until recently. I was the Secretary Mnuchin talk about the fact that stock would have value. The idea that we ought to be identifying potential product lines or institutions that pose systemic risk to the whole industry. So that was a major step in moving in that direction. Obviously, looking at product lines, we talked about the transparency issues on other issues like derivatives and so forth. I think will help as well in providing us with better information about what's occurring in those financial service areas. And it's all working well today, by the way. All the concerns that were raised about the fact that this is going to create future problems have not turned out to be the case. One point that Barney has made over and over again, and I agree with him on, and that is we had a lot of complaints about people saying, well, you've stripped the ability of the Federal Reserve system to respond to a future crisis by providing capital during times of deep difficulty, such as one we're going through. It turned out that Jay Powell has proved them all wrong. In fact, was able to take advantage. The 13.3 section, I don't want to bore people with too many details, but the 13.3 section is working fine in a sense. That the capital has become available, and as a result, we've been able to handle at least part of the economic crisis we're dealing with today. So again, I think we had needed to understand the growing presence of sort of the shadow banking system has posed some significant problems. The CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, is not limited. They've been looking at payday lenders and other matters. Some of them would qualify, I suppose, but others would not, in terms of how consumers get injured and harmed by an institution that doesn't meet the legal or technical definition of a financial institution or a bank, can also be the subject of their efforts.
Okay, they're looking at the payday lenders, but does it disappoint you to see that all of the progress that you made, somewhat of which is being undone right now? Payday lenders today are far more emboldened than they were 2 years ago. We saw payday lenders in the last month receive PPP loans from the government. And then if you want to tack in the shadow banking, look at all that private equity funds have done in the last 5 or so years. And now they're watching middle market companies that they own. They're watching those stocks get bought up by the Fed.
Well, again, your opening remark, I'm disappointed on some of these specific issues. But let me come back and reinforce the point that's been made by others already today in this conference is we now have the structure and the architecture to address those issues under the proper administration. Barney and I never guaranteed that we would be able to solve all future problems. And the political system in this country elects where votes matter. And so we lost the head of the Consumer Protection Bureau. We had the head of the budget become the temporary head of the CFPB. The fact that they're still there, and the Supreme Court decision the other day, where I'm sure our opponents were praying that the court would declare the entire act unconstitutional, or at least the CFPB unconstitutional, proved to be quite the opposite. So I'm disappointed by some of the decisions, but I want to remind people today in this conference, we're not going anywhere. There was no efforts really made to repeal Dodd-Frank as it was in healthcare. And yeah, they made some votes and things that I didn't like. I would have voted against them myself, but they didn't go to the heart of what we've done. The heart of what we did 10 years ago is the law of the land today in the United States.
Was there not the political will or the lobbying effort will to repeal Dodd-Frank, Congressman? Because at the end of the day, it worked. If you talk to some of the biggest bank CEOs over the last 10 years, when Dodd-Frank was first introduced, they were devastated. They thought it would crush their business. And then in the subsequent years, you saw those same CEOs say, by the way, Dodd-Frank made us better and smarter and stronger.
Two things I would say about that. First of all, you're right that it was political fear that kept the Republicans from doing this. The fact is that even during the angriest times with the Tea Party and the upset about the TARP, which was at the same time one of the most successful and unpopular things the federal government ever did, financial reform was popular. The Consumer Bureau in particular. So the Republicans, while the ideologues wanted to go after it, the Republican leadership was told by most of their members, I don't want to have to vote on that. I don't want to have to choose between the Tea Party and the bulk of my voters. So, as Chris noted, it's a great contrast where they tried to repeal healthcare, which later became more popular, and financial reform, which was always more popular. And as to the big banks, I think they discovered two things. First of all, and this was a factor, there was pressure on the banks. There's pressure on people in any industry to go to the bottom. If your competitors, for stock investors, for customers, for whatever, are engaging in activities that aren't the right sort morally, but look profitable, you can be heard. We have the famous statement from Chuck Prince, who was at Citicorp. When the music's playing, you got to dance. I asked him at one point why he was using a technique that allowed the bank to incur debt but keep it off the balance sheet. I think it was called the Structural Investment Vehicle, a SIV appropriately. He said, well, if I don't do this, Goldman will beat me in the stock market because their balance sheet will look better. It also, I think, helped us internationally. The fact that American financial institutions, including our stock market, have a reputation for being very well regulated is a source of strength. It is one of the reasons why the dollar is so strong, why this is still a place people want to put their money. And one of the reasons is that they're safe here. And so you have this competitive protection against inappropriate action. You have the reputation for safety and the fact that, frankly, we knew what we were doing. And what we banned, and this is the key, what we prevented people from doing was incurring, it comes down to incurring more debt that they could handle. And absent regulation, you could get some kind of, you had competitive pressure to do the things that incurred more debt that you could handle. And we have relieved every financial institution that wants to be responsible from the pressure not to be.
In his remarks earlier today, President Obama said this: "We were met every step of the way by entrenched and well-funded opposition who tried to block any reform at all." During this whole debate back in 2009, President Obama also said this. He was calling out Republican leaders and said, just last week, Republican leaders in the House summoned more than 100 key lobbyists for the financial industry to a pep rally and urged them to redouble their efforts to block meaningful financial reform. Not that they needed the encouragement. The industry lobbyists had already spent more than $300 million on lobbying that year. Given that this was the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, and that an economic crisis isn't partisan, Were you surprised, Senator, that you were met with such ferocious opposition from the industry that had largely brought this upon themselves, and then how quickly it became so partisan?
Well, yeah, certainly it was. And I was surprised that the industry didn't step up earlier. I remember I made a recommendation to some of the people in the financial services sector when the problems first emerged in '08. It may sound simple to people, but I said, why don't you come on down to Washington and bring a bunch of your brightest young people who know this industry well, take out the top floor of one of the hotels, roll up your sleeves, and offer to go to work on behalf of the country, free of charge, to help us get back on our feet again. They were just tone deaf, it seems to me, about recognizing it was a moment for them to step up and help get us back on a better track than we were clearly on. And for whatever reason, I don't know who was listening or who they were listening to politically, but they were just digging a deeper hole for themselves all the time. Someone suggested we ought to mention some things that people may not be aware of. I remember going and meeting with the Financial Services Roundtable. Now, it predates a lot of this, but nonetheless, it's instructive. And that's a big group. That's your largest institutions that come to Washington once a year and talk about these issues. And this was, again, predated the actual events of the catastrophe. But I got excited about it. It was 2007. I thought, well, this is my first chance as the chairman of the banking committee to listen. And basically two issues they wanted to bring up. They were frightened to death of a Consumer Protection Bureau, and they wanted to talk about executive compensation. I remember leaving the room thinking, here they had the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. There are a lot of these product lines which are complicated. And here's an opportunity for it to maybe educate me from their perspective on things that I ought to understand better. And it was just stunning to me that the major issues they wanted to talk about were their pay and a bureau that would protect the very customers they try to service every day from being taken advantage of. So they were tone deaf through all of this. Now, the good news is you're not today.
Surprised by that or disappointed by that?
Normally you think they're getting advice, whether they thought of themselves. I thought, well, someone's going to pull them aside and say, listen, we just went through the bailing out major institutions here with billions of dollars from taxpayers. I remember one of the fights we had, and Barney will remember this, 1:30 in the morning before the TARP vote. Frankly, it was Hank Paulson was very upset that we were going to put restrictions on executive compensation as part of the TARP package. And I said, you're kidding me. We're asking the taxpayer to write a check for $700 billion, and you still want to be able to get, bonuses. And finally, Hank said, forget it, they won't sign on to the TARP bill. Well, we managed to prevail that particular argument that night at 2:00 in the morning. But that was sort of the mentality we were going through. So yeah, it was surprising to me. There was a bitter price. People didn't realize the moment they were in. But let me just say in fairness to them, I think today they're doing a much better job. I think their reputations are better. More work needs to be done. But I'm it's showing me a lot wiser industry politically than they certainly were in '07 and '08. That's for sure. And 10.
Well, hubris and extreme wealth can often delay one's ability to be a little bit more self-aware. Congressman, when you think back, were there any points where you thought this thing isn't going to happen? We're not going to get this legislation through. And were there things you maybe had to leave on the table in order to get it through?
You're right. Let me just add a little bit to what Chris said. I was struck, and it's true. Hank Paulson, whom I agreed on a lot of things, just put up a terrific fight. And his argument was interesting. It was that if we put restrictions on executive compensation, the executive in question would refuse to participate. Now, understand what that means. This was a program that they presumably understood was going to save the economy. And people making much more money than any human being could probably spend in 2 lifetimes in a couple of years were objecting to a fairly small reduction in their compensation and was so angry that Paulson thought they might walk away from this cooperative effort. And I got to say, that was an impugning of their patriotism. I also think, I never read War and Peace. I'm going to read it after I do a Rubik's Cube. But there is one part of it that seems to me very, very relevant. There's a guy, he's a prince, and I can't tell you, I forget his name, but he's played by Henry Fonda in the movie. And he's riding in a battle against Napoleon, and he says, "My God, they're shooting at me, who everybody loves." And that was the impression I got from some of the financial executives. They were used to being lionized and treated very respectfully and held out to be these great wizards. And all of a sudden, people are yelling at them. And remember that ridiculous comment from Goldman Sachs, from Lloyd, we're doing God's work. And I think a large part of it was that, or was Steve Schwartzman talking about this was like Kristallnacht. I mean, they were just offended. They couldn't believe that we were all, as a country, so ungrateful to them for the great benefits they'd given us. As to when did I think it might fall apart, there were 2 points. One was when we ran into a problem, and I said the big banks generally didn't have much influence. But there was one point where there was an issue actually over a federal preemption of state law. And the Bush administration had put through a program whereby states had no power to regulate banks. They could only be regulated by the federal people, the national banks. And we were reversing that substantially. And the biggest banks were so upset about that we had a problem with some of our New York Democrats and Chicago Democrats who represented areas where the big banks had a lot of employees, and that was their crowd, not contributions. And there was a serious problem there. Steny Hoyer, who's a great legislative technician, I went to him and said, "Steny, this could come down over this." And he negotiated a deal so that we preserved the importance of allowing the states with some compromise. The other issue, very relevant to today, there was a large number of African Americans on the committee then and now, because it was always a committee of urban jurisdiction and housing. And the African American community was hurt worse than anybody else by the financial crisis, including, by the way, the fact that African American banks had been major purchasers of the preferred stock technical point. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, a number of them were in trouble. We were trying to protect them. And a number of the African American members were told by their constituents, "Hey, you're saving America, how about us?" And the group, led by Maxine Waters, now the chair, and some others, that included, I think, all of the 9 or 10 members of the Congressional Black Caucus, said they couldn't vote for the bill unless we got some major concessions. And I did ask, and Rahm Emanuel came and talked, and we made some progress to the point where they didn't vote against the bill, but they didn't vote for it. They absented themselves from the meeting, and we won by 1 vote. That was one of the nights when I kept counting Democrats and finally got to 36, was okay. So those were the 2 crisis points. They were, and by the way, and I want to make this point, and I know the view is that there's too much money in politics, and I generally agree with that, except on those occasions when I needed some. But the fact is that as we made this bill and we dealt with it, and I think Chris will agree, the obstacles we ran into were either, the most of them, either honest ideological opposition from some people, or constituent pressure. Campaign contributions had, in my experience, I do not remember, and we talk honestly to each other in private, I don't remember anybody ever suggesting that they couldn't do a certain thing on our committee, or even in the House as a whole, because of contributions. People told me, I can't vote for that because of this constituency group. Or, I just think you're not being tough enough. But I think and Bob Kaiser has written this wonderful book about the process, and I think you see when you read that, honest conviction and political constituent pressure were by far the greater influences than campaign contributions, even when we're talking about regulating the richest people in America.
How did you deal with,
Stephanie,
I mean, yes?
Stephanie, I've got to make one correction, Stephanie, if I can. This is where modern technology comes in. My staff sent me an email. Bob Corker was very helpful he was one who suggested that the Federal Reserve is where the Consumer Protection Bureau should be housed. He was not the creator of the consumer. If I had said that, I apologize. That was a mistake. But Bob did play a role.
This illustrates the point you were both making earlier, the extraordinarily talented and selfless staffs you both had and have to this day. Can you give us an example, a non-public story, something we haven't heard yet, and you can change names or leave them out to protect one's identities, that sort of illustrates the thrill of victory or agony of defeat in terms of going through this process? Senator?
Well, there are quite a few moments. I thought it was a great question, and I think we'll protect the innocent in all this, but certainly a moment that Barney and I can both share, having gone through it. Literally, and I'm not exaggerating here, the vote on the floor of the Senate was occurring, the final passage of the bill. And all of a sudden, one of my supporters indicated they had a problem, and couldn't vote for the bill. Well, if I got 59 votes, we'd not be having this conversation today, Stephanie. And so it involved New England, and I got a hold of my friend in the House, who I think, Barney, without telling state secrets, I think you were in the House gym, because he would have voted on this. And I called Barney and I said, we got a problem. Now the vote's occurring. And it took about 10 minutes or so, but we resolved the problem with Barney's assistance and help with people he was aware of and knew. And the person ended up voting for the bill, and we got the 60th vote and passed. I don't know if that's written anywhere, but it was one of those critical moments. You can't get much closer than that when you're literally, the clock is running and the votes are counting. And had we lost that vote, we would have been having an intellectual conversation today about Dodd-Frank, not a discussion about the signing of the bill. That's one. I'll tell more, but that's one. I don't know if Barney remembers that or not. It's pretty critical.
Congressman, how about for you?
Well, that was clearly one of them where we were involved in. I was in the gym and went in my gym clothes to our offices to meet with our great staff director, Gene Lathanowick, and two of my staff, Jim Siegelman and Dave Smith, wound up in a sort of double negotiation, one with the senator in question, the other with Paul Volcker, because it involved the Volcker rule. And we worked it out. The one that bothered me, I will leave out the name. One of my regrets is that we weren't tough enough in the bill on the question of risk retention. I think anybody who incurs a debt for the society should have to bear some of the responsibility if that debt is not repaid. And we put the principle in. It was especially important for mortgages. And as we were getting into conference, a senator, and I used to talk about that, Chris gave you the context, it seemed to me that there were people who took turns being Senator 60. That is, they would come to you knowing that you had 59 votes, but you needed that senator to get to 60. And in this case, Senator 60 had been approached by mortgage brokers who wanted an exemption from the restriction that you couldn't securitize without some holding on to the risk for super good loans. And I didn't like the idea, was worried about it, but 60 is 60. And Chris, in his total good faith, and let me aside, one of the things I'm proud of stuff, the House and the Senate don't get along the way they should. Egos get in the way, turf gets in the way, and here is one of the most complicated, politically treacherous legislative things you ever had to deal with, and there was never any friction between me and Chris, or between the House and the Senate through us in that regard. And our staff, to that credit, worked very well and cooperatively together. But I had to give in. And so we created this category for loans that could be exempt. I mean, there were supposed to be three kinds of loans. Loans that were so bad you couldn't make them. Loans that you could make but were subject to risk retention. And then the small category of loans that were golden, and you didn't have to worry about risk retention. The trouble is those last two categories got the exception ate up the rule. Because of the language that was developed at this senator's complaint, the loophole became such that there are now two kinds of loans. Loans you can't make unless you're a small bank and want to keep in your portfolio, which is fine with me, you bear the risk. Or loans that are not subject to risk retention. Ironically, almost every other kind of securitization is subject to risk retention more heavily than loans. I think that's a good thing. So that was a loss that I didn't realize the dimensions until later, when a very interesting coalition of the banks and the liberal advocacy groups got together and insisted on broadening that loophole.
Yeah, good point.
No,
Stephanie, it's important.
Yes.
No, I was just going to say it's the other moment I was going to share, and Barney knows about this one as well. The Republicans came to us with a paid-for bill at the end of the conference. We had to have a paid-for the cost of the bill, but large, but had to have a paid-for. They came up with one that we thought was acceptable, and I think Barney, I think there's a picture behind Barney's head. I don't know if that's the same picture, Barney, of us about 6 o'clock in the morning, and we're signing.
I can't get it in notebook.
Support. We moved to the Senate and House for votes. Again, a couple of Republicans, one particularly came and said, I can't vote for that paid for. I'm off the bill. Now I'm short again by one vote. I spent almost a day with a parliamentarian of the Senate, with something I'd never done before, to convince him that signing a conference report was not tantamount to voting for the conference report. So even though everyone had signed it, or not signed it, he had the majority of votes, and therefore there was no changing the conference report. And it literally took me almost a day to convince the parliamentarian to do something he had never agreed to before. And that was the assigned conference report, until voted upon, has not been adopted, even though the conferees have signed it. So we had to reconvene the conference report here, change the paid for to meet the concerns that have been raised, and then go back again. And again, one of those moments that, again, you're hanging by your fingernails. Had the parliamentarian of the Senate said, I'm sorry, that's it, the bill would have died as well.
You have both been out of Congress for the last 10 years, but what you can give us is extraordinary perspective. You've both independently said throughout this hour that while it was hugely successful, it was enormously unpopular. I'm speaking about TARP. Yeah. Fast forward to the economic rescue that we're seeing today, the trillions of dollars that the U.S. government is giving to small and large businesses. You can also add in all that the Fed is doing. How concerned are you, Congressman, about the lack of oversight and the backlash that's to come?
I'm not as concerned as some of my friends. First of all, we are talking here about compensating people for something that was done to them, not by them. The problem with the TARP was that the many of the recipients of TARP funds were the malefactors. Although we will expect the federal government made money off every part of the TARP, ironically, except the one part of the TARP that was popular, the automobile loans. Remember, the TARP money kept General Motors and Chrysler in business. And Ford said if they had gone out of business, Ford would have suffered too, because there would have been no supply chain. But the banks were the villains, many of them. And there are no villains here. None of this money is going to anybody who is held accountable for causing the crisis. Secondly, it's much more broadly shared. Everybody, many people are getting something, which is helpful. Even with that, yeah, there is some problem, but I have two responses to that. First of all, when we have people, and that's to say the unemployment, it's hard to do something in a very short period of time on a massive scale without error. So the question is, which errors are worse? To me, the errors of people in need, children who are stressed, parents who can't make it, people facing eviction, the possibility that they will not get any help troubles me a lot more than a couple of people who got help that shouldn't. We're a rich enough country when we're talking about this to err on the side of compassion. So that's why I don't worry as much. Secondly, it's a very difficult process to do this as in this time period. I think, frankly, it's been done on the whole rather well. But my basic point is this. Let me just take one example, the $600 stipend. You have some people, conservatives mostly, saying, well, don't do that, because if people get that $600, some of them won't come back to work, and the economy will be hurt. Yeah, but more of them are people who need that $600. And I'm more distressed at the thought that there are families, children, other people who will be in real pain if they don't get the $600 than the small number of people who might be taking a free ride on it. So again, I would err on the side of keeping it going.
Senator, what do you think?
I agree with Barney. I think it makes sense. Obviously, we got a major problem come this fall. I know they're grappling with the issue now in the Senate and the House on the third or fourth tranche of assistance. I hope it's going to focus again on caring for other people, children, child care. You're never going to get the economy moving again. I authored back 30 years ago the Act for Better Child Care, the first child care program since World War II. That was a fight then to get it done because we were dealing with a generation that didn't understand how important that is today. You cannot recover without it. So I'm hopeful they can do some of these things to allow us to get through this until a vaccine comes up. I think it's tragic we have this kind of mindless opposition to people wearing masks in public gatherings here. It's stunning to me that national leaders, a national leader particularly, is advocating a policy different than all the advice to the contrary. So I think trying to help people through this until we get back on our feet again makes all the sense. And the point that Barney made is absolutely on target. This is not writing a check to people who created this problem. We are faced with a healthcare crisis, the likes of which we've never seen before. It's now exceeding, I think, the so-called Spanish flu of 100 years ago. And not to step up, not to do these things, I think would be indictable, reprehensible. So I agree with Barney entirely.
One thing that we've seen since the pandemic has caused this economic crisis, and we mentioned it earlier, is that our banking system is stronger and better since Dodd-Frank. However, we also see the huge growth in non-bank financial firms, private equity firms, hedge funds, for example. What needs to be done from a regulatory perspective around those types of institutions becoming so large that we're then arguing, well, they're too big to fail and they need to be rescued. They need to be rescued next, when they put themselves in this situation and exaggerated the shadow banking system.
Is that to me or to Barney? Is it Barney?
Congressman.
We've done some of that. The way in which many of those non-banks were involved in the problem had to do with the one area where I think we had the worst problem, and we successfully resolved it to a great extent, and even the Trump administration has gone along, and that's derivatives. As Paul Volcker called them, instruments of financial mass destruction. We have resolved the derivative problem by putting them in exchanges, by requiring that counterparties be able to deal with it. And so the problem was, in the past, non-banks could get involved in derivative situations, could sell credit default swaps or whatever. And so whatever their activities are, that won't happen. The importance of that is this. It was through the derivatives, I think, that the problems of particular institutions ricocheted through the system. If a particular private equity fund gets into trouble now and it gets hurt, it's not as interconnected to the financial system as we would be worried about. That is, I think we've gotten to the point where, we never try to protect people from losses. We shouldn't. But the losses now more likely fall on the people who incurred the losses without systemic connections that make it worse. And one of the things we did do is, in the bill, we regulated functions as well as institutions. Now, that doesn't mean no problems with what these are doing, but they're not necessarily financial regulatory problems. I think there's a strong role for antitrust, and I'm glad to see Democrats, for instance, in the House, Dave Cicilline and others, Senator Warren has talked about this. They're looking at the antitrust implications of these agglomerations and noting that among the negative effects appears to be depressing wages. And so there are negative social impacts from large financial institutions buying up a lot of companies that are not within the jurisdiction of financial regulation, but should be looked at in other ways.
Senator, does Congress always need a historic crisis to enact pro-consumer or pro-little guy legislation? Because it often seems that in good times, the bigger get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they keep pushing the limits until things get broken, and then we're in crisis.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, that's pretty much the way it is and has been historically. I've often said, and I think Barney and I agree on this, we could have never passed Dodd-Frank in 2007 or even 2008. Maybe if we had tried early, I don't think so. We certainly couldn't have passed it in 2011 after the 2010 elections. Windows open up. You take advantage of a crisis, if you will, where people are focused on it. And you can then do some things that people would acknowledge should be done. But there doesn't seem that sense of the urgency of now that we've used that happens until people actually are feeling it. And so that's why it's so important. I said this, I know, at the beginning of our conversation, Stephanie, but we almost didn't get it done because we ended up acting later. And it sounds ridiculous to talk about less than 2 years later, but even 2 years later, the country moves on. You know, we're listening to these huge issues today that go in front of us here. All of us at this gathered here like this and listening, well, we're only one hurricane away from changing the subject in America. And so you have to act when these moments occur or you miss them. And that was true of healthcare. It's true of financial reform. It's true of what we're dealing with now on the issue of minorities, of communities, and financial services, using the word systemic risk no longer to confine it to a bank or a hedge fund, but to realize now a virus can be a systemic risk. Climate change can be a systemic risk to insurance companies, to banks, to all these shadow banking institutions, things that go way beyond what we traditionally were thinking of when we passed this bill. So we've got a lot of work to do. If I were advising the banking committee today and others, we did a good job, but it's 10 years ago. I could now bank with this in my hand. I can make deposits from my cell phone. You can't do that. Couldn't do that 10 years ago. So technology's better. New instruments are emerging. There's a lot to be done here. We did a good job 10 years ago, and it's great to celebrate it and talk about it. But there's a lot of work, particularly in serving underserved communities, particularly minorities and rural communities. A lot to be done to make sure that redlining isn't no longer just a local issue, it's a national issue because of the availability of financial services. So I would hope that our successors in all of this would really realize there's a lot more work to be done. You've got a crisis in front of you. Let's take advantage of it here now and make sure we can do some things we've talked about for years. So that's why I agree with Barney, and it's a perfect moment to move.
Well, you certainly didn't let that crisis go to waste. I want to thank you both for all that you've done and for joining us today and spending this hour with us. Dennis, thank you for this opportunity. It was really great to be with all of you.
Yeah, thanks to the three of you. What a fantastic discussion. We should make every member of the Financial Services Committee and the Senate Banking Committee watch this video and take the lesson of bipartisanship and the national interest. And maybe, Stephanie, we could get you up there and ask them a few pointed questions and make them answer them, and we get some progress around here. But it's really been a terrific discussion and a great public service from two giants who have been serving this country for so long and, frankly, continue to do so by offering their wisdom. So I can't thank you all enough.
Thanks, Dan.